It was one of those nights when the air itself felt heavy, charged with something unspoken, like a storm waiting on the horizon. I remember sitting at the edge of my bed, my phone in my hand, staring at a string of messages from my aunt that didn't make sense. They were frantic, broken, half-coherent, and all of them pointed to one horrifying fact. My cousin had just been rushed to the hospital, and his wife, my sister-in-law by marriage, was already there, battered and broken. I didn't believe it at first. How could I? My cousin had always been the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong, the one my family paraded in front of neighbors and relatives as the shining example of success and strength. And yet, within an hour, the story had flipped. He had viciously attacked his brother's wife, left her hospitalized with injuries serious enough to silence the whole family. And still, when I arrived at my uncle's house that night, I walked into something that felt more like a celebration than a reckoning. Plates of food still sat on the table. Half-drunk glasses of wine sparkled under dim chandelier light, and whispers filled the room. Whispers not of shame or horror, but of twisted admiration. "He protected us," one relative murmured. "He did what needed to be done," another said. It was as if they had rewritten reality in those few hours, bending cruelty into honor, blood into sacrifice. And there I stood, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach, realizing I was about to be the only one willing to speak the truth. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire through every branch of our family, yet somehow it had already been polished, reshaped, and packaged into something almost heroic. My cousin wasn't the violent man who had snapped and sent his brother's wife to the hospital. No, according to them, he was the savior, the strong hand who finally put her in her place. They spoke about her like she was the problem, as if her quiet defiance over the years, her unwillingness to bend and be the obedient wife they wanted, had made her deserving of what happened. I stood in the kitchen listening to my mother retell the incident to a neighbor, her voice hushed but brimming with pride, and I felt my skin crawl. She said, "He only did what was right, after everything she's put that family through, as though broken ribs and a concussion were some kind of justice." I wanted to scream, to tell them they were out of their minds, but when I opened my mouth, every eye in the room turned on me like knives. My aunt scowled and whispered that I was too young to understand family loyalty, and my uncle warned me not to spread poison about someone who had saved us from shame. That was the word they kept circling back to, shame. Not the shame of what he'd done, but the shame of her existence in their family, her refusal to mold herself into their expectations. The more they praised him, the more I realized I was standing in a room full of strangers, people who shared my blood but not my values, people who could twist cruelty into glory without a second thought. That night, when I finally saw her in the hospital, her face pale against the sheets and her voice trembling as she told me what happened, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let their lies win. Someone in this family had to tell the truth, even if it meant standing completely alone. I sat by her hospital bed, the steady beep of machines filling the silence as she tried to gather enough strength to speak. Her lips were cracked, her eye swollen nearly shut, and every word came out in a whisper, but the clarity in her voice cut sharper than anything my family had said in their living room. She told me how it started with an argument over nothing, a misplaced bill, a sarcastic remark, and then how his anger escalated in seconds. She said the moment his fist landed, she knew it wasn't the first time he had wanted to do it, only the first time he let himself. She described trying to crawl away, grabbing her phone, and how he yanked it from her and hurled it across the room. She said she blacked out halfway through the beating, and when she came to, she was already in the ambulance, strangers' voices telling her to stay awake. And yet, when she woke up in the hospital bed, it wasn't her husband's family, sitting there with shame in their eyes. It was them rallying behind him, calling him a hero for defending the family. As she told me this, tears streaming down her face, I felt a sickness in my stomach that words can't describe. I had grown up in the same family, surrounded by the same people, but I had never seen their cruelty so naked, so brazen. It was one thing to whisper gossip, another to disapprove quietly, but to stand united behind a man who brutalized his own brother's wife and then crown him their champion. It was madness. She grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my skin, and said, "Please, don't let them bury this. They'll try. You know they will." And I knew she was right. My family had already rewritten the story, and soon they would pressure her to stay silent, to forgive, to move on, to let their hero carry on untarnished. In that sterile hospital room, I made another vow. I would not let them erase her pain. If it meant tearing apart the image of the family I once thought I belonged to, so be it. The pressure started almost immediately. Within days, relatives were lining up outside her hospital room, not to apologize, not to show sympathy, but to persuade, to negotiate, to manipulate. They brought flowers, they brought homemade food, they brought words dripping with false concern. "You don't want to destroy the family over this," one aunt cooed, her hand resting too firmly on my sister-in-law's shoulder. "You'll heal, you'll move on, and he'll learn his lesson." Another uncle, standing tall and self-important, declared that filing charges would ruin all of us because the community looked up to our family name, as though her broken bones were less of a disgrace than the gossip of neighbors. They were so relentless, it felt like I was watching a theater performance where everyone had rehearsed their lines. Every person who came through that door repeated the same script: protect the family, forgive the cousin, bury the truth. I stood in the corner, arms folded, biting my tongue so hard it nearly bled, because I knew if I interrupted, if I shouted at them for their cruelty, they would turn their fury on me instead. But when the door closed, and it was just the two of us, her and me, she gripped my hand like a lifeline. Her voice was fragile, but her eyes burned with a quiet rage. "They're trying to make me complicit in my own suffering," she whispered. "If I stay silent, I'm letting them win." She begged me not to leave her side, and I didn't. I slept on that stiff hospital chair, waking up every time the door creaked, ready to stand between her and their poisonous words. But outside the hospital, my phone was buzzing nonstop. My mother left voicemail after voicemail, her tone shifting from pleading to commanding. She said I was tearing the family apart by siding with an outsider, that my loyalty was supposed to be with blood, not with the woman who provoked him. My cousins messaged me in a group chat, their words sharp and cruel. "Traitor. Drama queen. You're embarrassing. Us." Screenshots of their messages piled up in my phone like evidence, and I saved every single one. I didn't delete a thing, because somewhere deep down, I knew this wouldn't end with whispered threats or family arguments. This would end in court, where facts mattered more than loyalty. And when the police finally came to take her statement, when the detectives asked for details, she looked at me before she answered, her eyes full of fear, but also defiance, and I nodded. I gave her the strength to tell them everything: dates, times, past incidents that she had brushed off or hidden. The truth spilled out in painful, shaking detail, and the officers wrote it all down. For the first time in days, I felt a shift. Small, but real. The narrative my family had built around him began to crack, and once a crack forms, it only takes pressure to split the whole thing apart. When word spread that she had spoken to the police, the phone calls turned from guilt trips into outright threats. "You'll regret this," my uncle hissed over the line. "Do you want your cousin in jail? Do you want to ruin his future?" My mother cried dramatically, saying she would never forgive me if I kept feeding lies. But here's the thing about lies: they crumble when you shine a light on them. And as much as they tried to smother me in shame, as much as they tried to paint me as the villain, I knew that my cousin's fists had already sealed his fate. They thought they could bury the evidence, but the truth was written all over her bruised body, in her medical records, in the photographs the nurses took, and in the trembling voice recordings of her telling the story. And I would make sure none of it ever disappeared. The case moved faster than anyone expected, and the moment police records became official, the cracks in the family facade widened into gaping fractures. My cousin was arrested, booked, and charged with aggravated assault, and for the first time in my life, I saw my relatives scatter like frightened birds. They had spent weeks calling him a hero, praising his strength and his courage, but the instant his mugshot was printed in the local paper, not one of them stood beside him in public. Instead, they whispered behind closed doors, their words shifting like sand. It was a mistake. He lost control for a moment. This has been blown out of proportion. They thought they could spin the story to outsiders the same way they did inside the family, but the truth was no longer in their hands. The truth was documented, photographed, written in black ink on official reports. I remember sitting in the courtroom during his arraignment, my sister-in-law on one side of me, her body still healing, and empty chairs where his so-called supporters should have been. The silence in the room was louder than any condemnation. He stood there in his suit, his face pale, his jaw tight, and for once, no one was calling him a hero. No one was clapping him on the back or praising his strength. The family that had crowned him their savior had suddenly forgotten his name, their loyalty evaporating the second it threatened to scorch their own reputations. And in that moment, as the judge read the charges, I saw it clearly. His entire life had been built on the illusion of protection, of favoritism, of never being held accountable. And now, stripped of that shield, he was nothing more than a man who thought his fists made him powerful, but the aftermath was just as telling. Relatives who once lectured me about loyalty now avoided me at gatherings, their eyes darting away as though I carried some contagious disease called truth. My mother, who once accused me of betrayal, began to speak in hushed tones about not knowing the whole story. And my uncle, who had sworn he would handle everything, now avoided my calls altogether. It was as if they believed ignoring me would erase the fact that I had stood my ground while they crumbled. Yet the irony was impossible to miss. The family that accused me of tearing us apart had done it themselves by protecting a man who destroyed any trust we had left. Sitting beside her months later when she finally returned home, I realized what real strength looked like. It wasn't in fists or in threats. It wasn't in the false bravado of a cousin who thought violence made him noble. It was in her ability to walk back into a house filled with memories of fear and decide she would no longer be silent. And it was in my decision to stand beside her, even when it meant losing everyone else. Because sometimes, the only way to save yourself is to let the family you thought you needed burn itself down to ashes. And from those ashes, you build a new kind of loyalty, one based not on blood, but on truth. When the trial began, the family tried one last desperate maneuver. They showed up in carefully chosen clothes, whispering to each other about presenting a united front, but the cracks were impossible to hide. On the witness stand, she spoke with a voice that trembled only at the start, steadying as she laid out every detail of that night, every bruise, every fracture, every humiliation. The courtroom was silent as she described crawling toward the door while he blocked her path, silent as she recalled the sickening sound of glass shattering when he hurled a lamp across the room, silent as she admitted that this wasn't the first time he had raised his hand, but it was the first time he hadn't stopped. My stomach twisted as I watched jurors scribble notes, their faces hardened with quiet outrage, and I knew that her courage in that moment was something no one in my family could ever erase. Then came the cross-examination, the defense attorney, circling like a shark, trying to twist her words, to make her sound unstable, hysterical, dramatic. He asked why she hadn't reported earlier incidents, why she stayed, why she didn't fight harder to escape. Each question was designed to turn her pain into suspicion, and every time, my family nodded along as if vindicated. But she didn't break. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Because I was afraid, and because your client made sure fear was the only language I spoke." The room fell silent again, and in that silence I saw the truth cut sharper than any lawyer's tricks. Outside the courthouse, relatives who once called me traitor now avoided even standing near me, their faces tight with embarrassment as reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. They couldn't spin this anymore. They couldn't twist violence into loyalty when the evidence was there in hospital reports, in photographs, in sworn testimony. My cousin, their golden boy, their so-called hero, was shackled by the very system they thought they could manipulate. Watching him led back into custody, head down, I felt no triumph, only a strange, heavy clarity. Justice wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't painless, but it was real. And real was enough. But the fallout didn't stop with the verdict. Friends of the family began to whisper behind their backs. Community members looked at them differently. Business associates backed away. The empire of respect they had built over decades crumbled piece by piece, not because of me, not even because of her, but because of their own desperate need to protect a violent man at all costs. The irony was brutal. They had feared shame, and in trying to avoid it, they had invited something far worse: exposure. And as I watched it unfold, I knew one thing for certain: I would never again mistake blood for loyalty. The months after, the sentencing stretched into a long, quiet season that felt like walking through the ruins of a house you once thought was indestructible. My cousin was no longer the golden boy of the family. He was inmate number 4027, another man in a jumpsuit whose fists had finally betrayed him. And with him gone, the silence from my relatives was deafening. No more late-night calls trying to guilt me into changing sides. No more family meetings disguised as interventions. What remained was avoidance. Long pauses when my name came up, invitations that got lost in the mail, cousins who crossed the street rather than meet my eyes. The same people who had once screamed at me for tearing the family apart now couldn't even look at me, because deep down they knew the truth. It wasn't me who tore it apart. It was their devotion to protecting a violent man at all costs. At first, that silence was painful. I would sit in my apartment late at night, scrolling through old photos of birthdays, weddings, graduations, and feel the weight of loss. There was grief in realizing that the family I thought I belonged to had never really existed. It was an illusion, a mask they wore until reality forced it off. But over time, the grief gave way to something stronger. In their absence, my life began to fill with people who didn't demand silence as the price of belonging. Friends who brought me meals after long days at court, neighbors who checked in, co-workers who slipped me notes of encouragement when they saw me break down in the bathroom. These people weren't bound to me by blood, but they showed more loyalty in a single act of kindness than my relatives had in a lifetime of empty words. And her, my sister-in-law, she became proof that survival could be louder than shame. I watched her transform from a woman whose body and spirit had been battered into silence into someone who could stand in a room full of strangers and tell her truth without trembling. She started volunteering at a women's shelter, sitting across from women who bore the same bruises she once did, telling them, "You are not crazy. You are not alone. You are not to blame." Her courage rippled outward, changing lives far beyond her own. And every time I saw her speak, every time I saw another woman's eyes light with recognition, I knew that my cousin's violence hadn't silenced her. It had made her voice impossible to ignore. But the irony, the bitter taste I still carry, is how my family reacted in the aftermath. Instead of acknowledging what they had done, instead of apologizing for praising a man who brutalized his brother's wife, they tried to rewrite the story once again. They whispered about how the trial was unfair, about how the media exaggerated everything, about how we had humiliated ourselves by airing dirty laundry in public. They refused to see that the humiliation wasn't in telling the truth, but in the years they spent protecting a man at the expense of a woman's safety. That denial became their prison, and in many ways, it was harsher than the one my cousin sat in. They could no longer hold their heads high at church. They could no longer boast at barbecues about their perfect family. They could no longer look at their neighbors without wondering what was being whispered behind their backs. They had feared shame above all else, and in protecting him, they drowned in it. I used to wonder if I had gone too far, if standing against all of them had been reckless, selfish, cruel. But the more I watched her heal, the more I saw her smile, return. The more I realized that silence would have been the real cruelty. Silence would have chained us to a cycle of violence, allowed the next golden boy to believe his fists could be justified, allowed the next woman to be broken in the name of family honor. By refusing silence, I broke that cycle. Maybe I lost a family, but I gained something far more important: freedom. Freedom from the suffocating grip of loyalty twisted into control. Freedom from the illusion that blood demands obedience. Freedom from the guilt they tried to brand into my skin. Today, when I look back, I don't see a tragedy. I see a reckoning. My cousin sits behind bars, my family hides in the shadows of their own lies. But she and I, we're standing in the light. We're building something they can't touch, something real. Because family isn't defined by last names or shared holidays. It's defined by who shows up when you're bleeding, by who tells the truth when lies feel safer, by who refuses to let your story be rewritten. And if that means I had to burn bridges so completely they can never be rebuilt, then so be it. I don't regret a single match I struck. So tell me, after everything, after the lies, the threats, the trial, and the silence, do you think I went too far? Or do you think, like I do, that not going far enough would have been the biggest betrayal of all?